Ideas of India, a podcast where we examine academic ideas that can propel India forward. My name is Shruti Rajagopalan, and this is the 2024 Job Market series where I speak with young scholars entering the academic job market about their latest research on India. I spoke with Aarushi Kalra, a PhD candidate in economics at Brown University. We discussed her job market paper titled Hate in the Time of Algorithms, Evidence from a Large-Scale Experiment on Online Behavior. We talked about the demand and supply of toxicity against minorities on social media platform, user behavior, platform behavior, real-world segregation due to ethnic violence, and much more. For a full transcript of this conversation, including helpful links of all the references mentioned, click the link in the show notes or visit mercatus.org/podcasts. Sometimes it can feel like a full-time job keeping tabs on the latest development in politics in India. If you're struggling to keep up, let the Grand Tamasha podcast be your guide. Grand Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, one of the world's most respected think tanks, and the Hindustan Times, one of India's leading media houses. Each week, host Milan Vaishnav takes listeners on a deep dive into Indian politics, economics, foreign policy, culture, and society. Over the past 5 years, Grand Tamasha has published more than 200 conversations on the issues that matter most to Indians and those who watch India from abroad, featuring guests ranging from the comedian Hasan Minhaj to the historian Ramachandra Guha and the philanthropist Rohini Nilekani. Grand Tamasha is available wherever you listen to your podcasts. Subscribe now to get your weekly infusion of timely and provocative India content straight to your personal device. New episodes are released every Tuesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Visit www.grandtamasha.com to browse past episodes and to learn more about the show. Hi Aarushi, welcome to the show. It's such a pleasure to see you again and speak with you.
Thank you so much, Shruti, for having me. I'm really excited.
You know, you have a job market paper on something that's super topical right now because we're all talking about how a very polarized and toxic kind of politics and conversation is playing out on social media. And this is happening across the world, right? It's happening in Brazil. It's happening in the United States. Of course, it's happening in India. And in your job market paper, you're studying this in India through a very large-scale randomized control trial. And in this paper, you basically try to answer the big question of whether social media users engage with harmful content or toxic content because the recommendation algorithms are pushing users towards them, or because users genuinely prefer that kind of content and they might go seeking it. And to test this, you ran this large-scale RCT with over 1 million users of a social media platform that shall remain unnamed, but it is TikTok-like. And you basically look at Hindi language posts, and you find that without the personalization algorithm, users saw or viewed 27% less toxic content, but they also spend 35% less time on that particular social media platform overall, right? And on the other hand, if they are personalized, this is not true, right? They see more toxic content, or they may see more toxic content, but they also engage more. And the even more interesting result I found was that the proportion of toxic posts that are shared for each toxic post that is viewed actually increases by 18%. Mm-hmm. Even though, if they are randomized, the total number of toxic posts viewed is fewer, but the number that's shared goes up. So basically showing that in some sense, those with a stronger preference for this kind of toxic or polarized content are still seeking it out and still want to share it with others. And while these algorithms may amplify certain types of engagement, there is also a deep-seated preference amongst users who may be drawn towards that content. That's what's going on with the users. And the second or rather the third result that I found interesting is there's a trade-off at the platform level, because the more randomized the content, which means, on average, the average individual is exposed to less toxic content. They also engage less on the platform, which means that the platform may not do as well if their revenues are coming from engagement and sharing. Is this a good summary of what you've tried to do? Because it's quite a complex setup and you're studying something that is super nuanced. So I want to make sure we get the setup right.
This was a really nice summary. I will just say one thing about the result on toxic shares. So basically, I do find that the total number of toxic posts shared and viewed both go down. But as a proportion of exposure, the number of toxic posts that are shared actually goes up. So it's really sort of in a relative sense, sharing is actually sort of worsening.
Yeah. So, okay. So before we get into that, maybe this is a good time for you to tell us why you ran this experiment. Then we can get into what these results mean.
So I think there's a very big narrative in India about how, the IT cell in India is kind of, leading people down these rabbit holes. There was also some stories in media about how there's a very big infrastructure that leads people into engaging with this kind of content. I always felt like this was a very one-sided story because this was focused entirely on the supply side. What I wanted to see is what is going on in the demand side, that we think that people are these passive users, whereas what I find and what my hunch was sort of going into this was also that people are active users who are going to seek out the content that they want to engage with. So I think that was the starting point for this experiment and project. The second thing, I think a deeper motivation is also, like you pointed out, the trade-off for the platform itself. So I think while the paper does suggest that platforms cannot be expected to self-regulate, I think it's also a larger question of whether, we can design a system where the values of a platform can ever be aligned with the values of a benevolent social planner, because users seek it out and the platform clearly sort of does benefit in a certain sense from, creating these filter bubbles. So it's also about how do we think of policy that sort of maybe cross-platform so that we can come up with systems that are safer for everyone to use, including minority communities. So when I first started this project, the initial motivation was just to understand what are the drivers of hate speech in India on social media. So I was looking at various changes in incomes, in political power, to see if what we're seeing in the unfortunate situation that we're seeing in India right now, is it a product of backlash? I think that is very hard to study because changes in the real world are much slower than changes on online platforms. So I started thinking about what are the randomized control trials that I can run on the platform itself. And one big reason that people identify these algorithms as public enemy number one in terms of driving this kind of behavior. So that is where I wanted to intervene and see how true that is.
You define toxic content as posts that are hateful, harmful, or likely to make someone feel unwelcome or leave a discussion. And this can be against any group. It can be against a majority group, a minority group. It could be across religious, ethnic, gender, caste, linguistic lines. So it's across the board. So you don't sneak in any particular bias of what you may find toxic. And to assess this, you actually use this Google Perspectives API to look at 20 million posts. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
I found that extraordinary that you were able to, not you personally, but through machine learning, you were actually able to extract and study 20 million posts. So at the baseline level, when you say toxic, you mean quite generally toxic, right? So,
right.
Like if there's someone out there who thinks it's okay to kill all people who own horses, let's say,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's kind of very targeted toxic content, though that might not be very particularly on caste or linguistic lines. You also, of course, more specifically look at the question of minority rights in India, or
Mm-hmm.
rather minority groups in India more than
Right.
minority rights. Did I get that part right? Because I want to make sure our setup is right, because there's so many moving parts to this.
Right, absolutely. I think this is a very important point. So I think you're right at baseline. I do consider toxicity in general, like it could be sexist posts. So unfortunately, in that definition, even, sexist jokes like wife beating up husband kind of a thing would also might just be included in this definition. So there's not much I can do about that because the perspective API technology is basically the best out there. Like I can't write an algorithm that does better than that. But what I do is that I focus on political posts that are toxic, and that intersection kind of takes me to specifically anti-minority posts.
Yeah. And the sample is enormous. You're talking about a platform that has about 200 million users, right? You're treating only 20 million in the experiment, and about 4 million are selected overall. So it's pretty large scale. And was there a reason you chose only the Hindi language users? They're about a
Mhm.
fifth of the total number of users. So it's
Yeah,
not a narrow sliver that you're picking. It's a pretty large number. But
right.
was there a reason for it? Is it because that's what the IT cells are supposed to be targeting? Or was
Mhm.
it just for linguistic consistency and to be able to use the API? Like, what is the reason for
Yeah.
that?
It was mostly linguistic accuracy. Like I am most proficient in Hindi out of all the more than a dozen languages on this platform. And I think it's a very interesting question just about language. Like this scholar at Rutgers, Kiran Garimalla, he has a paper comparing hate
Yes.
speech in different languages. And it's very interesting how it plays out in different contexts and languages. But I thought that given that I'm machine learning a bunch of stuff, I wanted to be confident in what I'm doing. So I chose to stick with Hindi for this project.
The way I understand it is there are different kinds of users on social media, right? So I follow a lot of dog related posts because I'm a dog crazy person and I have two dogs. Even my dogs have Instagram accounts. So I follow a lot of dog content, right? And
Yeah.
the way it goes is the more dog content you follow, the more of that kind of content is fed to you. Or rather, personalized for you. Maybe fed makes it seem like there's a puppet master pulling the strings, but it's basically personalizing it based on the preferences. I think I have recently made the mistake of seeing too many memes on the Toba Toba song, which means more memes on the Toba Toba song will show up on my feed, right? So that's part of it.
Right.
So now there are going to be all kinds of users. There are some folks like me who are basically really not looking for political content. We're looking for dog content
Right.
or funny memes. And
Um,
there are people who are very specifically looking for user content. So
mhm.
when you turn off personalization and replace it with randomization, what is the effect on these very diverse groups of people? Because you're looking at a particular kind of post, which is political post. So
Right.
is it a homogeneous effect? Is it a heterogeneous effect? Maybe you can shed some light on the behavior of users on social media.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for me, for instance, there's a lot of cat videos that I see. So if I were treated, I might just start getting dog videos, and it's debatable how whether I would like that or not. And basically the big decrease in total viewership or total engagement on the platform is essentially coming from the fact that people are not seeing this particular kind of niche content that they're used to seeing. So it's not the treatment in itself is not targeting toxic content because it's hard to sort of identify what is toxic, especially for the platform. Like they don't want to take a stand on what is toxic and what is not. So the treatment intensity in itself is different for different kinds of users. So, for instance, someone who is not seeing anything political at baseline is likely to start seeing some political posts.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if I was someone who sort of sought out this kind of nasty content on the internet, I'm going to see a lot less of that content. And it is the change in treatment intensity for this particular group that I'm going to be mainly exploiting
Yeah.
in order to draw my conclusions. As in the theoretical part of the paper, I try to think of an intervention that basically targets these toxic posts, but is something that is very hard to implement in the real world. So I do that theoretically.
So basically, one possibility is that someone like me who usually only sees dog posts could end up seeing more toxic posts with
Yes.
the randomization, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
while there are going to be some people who seek it out who will see fewer toxic posts,
Yeah.
I may also get turned off from the platform because I wasn't looking for that. So now I'm going to see more toxicity and I want to step away from it. Did
Right.
I get that right? I mean, are both these effects true? Because
Yeah.
when sometimes we look at only the results of the experiments, we're talking about the average treatment effect, right? And we don't
Right.
look at these very specific things going on.
Right. Yeah. And in some sense, the average treatment effect is a little misleading because the treatment intensity is different depending on who you are. So we're sort of violating, like, this doesn't fit into a framework where we can have the assumption that each unit is being treated by a similar treatment or the same exact treatment. So you're right that users who weren't seeing a lot of toxic content at baseline are people who start seeing more toxic content. Interestingly, what I find is that these are the people who don't change their behavior at all. Like, even though they're shown more toxic content, I find that they don't share more or less toxic content than the control group, in fact. Interestingly, these are also people who don't end up leaving the platform either. So it is the more sort of users who were seeing more toxic content at baseline. I find that they are the ones who are driving the aggregate change in total usage. But these are the people who, like, users who are not really moving, are the users who weren't seeing much toxic content at baseline. And so I try to dig further into what is the kind of content that these users are using or seeking out. And it's very interesting that a lot of them are sort of seeking out good morning messages, which is something, like my grandmother used to send me when, we taught her how to use WhatsApp. And we used to get like a big heart or a big rose with a good morning message every day. So it seems like these are the people who cannot, I mean, and this is a little speculative. Because I don't know what other things these people are doing. Like, I do have some survey data, so I can measure whether these people are using other apps, but all of that is self-reported data. And even in the survey data, I find that users who were seeing more toxic content at baseline are people who actually increased the amount of time they spent on other apps when they were treated. But users who were, engaging with good morning messages or religious messages, they didn't actually go anywhere else in the survey data too. So it seems that there might be some sort of cross-platform substitution going on for particular types of content. And I think toxic content is one of them. So in terms of elasticities, like just the percentage change in the number of toxic posts shared divided by the percentage change in the number of toxic posts viewed, I find that users who are seeing more toxic content at baseline are, yes, they're inelastic, but users who were seeing no toxic content at baseline are even more inelastic.
Yeah. And can you tell us what you mean by inelastic? Because this is a little less intuitive. So you're basically talking of, I want to separate two things, right? So you're talking about viewing posts versus sharing posts, right? So now what you find is the people who are treated are spending less time on the platform, so they're viewing fewer posts,
Yeah.
but they may also be sharing fewer posts, or they may be sharing more posts, given the proportion of what they're viewing. So would elasticity of toxic sharing be defined as the ratio of the percentage change in toxic posts shared to the percentage change in toxic posts viewed?
That's right. Yeah.
Did I get that right? Okay.
Yeah.
So let's say you have a great example in there. Maybe we should talk about that.
Yeah, the illustration on user behavior. Yeah, I think it's basically got to do with the fact that when I'm treated, I do see less toxic posts. And you're right that the distinction between viewing and sharing is that I'm thinking of viewing as being more passive. Like that is the stuff that the algorithm decides and the user doesn't decide. But the behavior part is something that, if sharing behavior part is something that users actively choose to do so. So I'm basically analyzing behavior by looking at sharing data. Back to the illustration on user behavior. So when a user is treated, they see a lower number of total posts just because they might, disengage from the platform because they're now seeing cat videos when they wanted to see dogs, which is again completely fair.
I like both. I'm willing to watch both, but I know there are dog people and cat people, but
Yeah.
sure.
I mean, yeah, and I personally prefer the ones with both dogs and cats getting along. I think those are really the best kind of videos. so so there are people who see less of everything, but when people are treated, the average user is also likely to see less toxic content. Now, as a result of the treatment, they may lower the total number of toxic posts that they share just because they're seeing less. But because of the disengagement effect, they will share even less content of all other varieties. So that effectively means that as a proportion of toxic content that I have been served, I'm going to end up sharing more of it just because I have a proclivity towards that kind of content. So one way of maybe thinking about this is that maybe if I were treated, I'm scrolling down, I'm not seeing dogs and cats, but then I see a toxic post, and when I see it, I share it. So that sort of increases the probability with which I'm going to share a toxic post when I see it.
Yeah. Yeah. And so this is what fascinates me. How much is this about preferences
Mhm.
versus salience of something on
Yeah,
a particular platform,
right.
right? So I have a preference for dogs versus cats or other kinds of animals, though I love all these animals. I even follow elephant accounts. I'm a bit an animal nutty. So let's say I have a preference for one,
Yeah,
and when it's personalized, then I'm obviously that's what keeps getting fed to me. Now, when it is not personalized, let's say I'm getting dog videos, cat videos, elephant videos, horse videos, and then a bunch of dogs and cats getting along, etc.,
right.
etc. Now, suddenly, because I had this preference for dog videos,
Mhm.
that's what I end up sharing more with other people. Now,
Exactly.
is that happening because I had a preference for it, or is it just standing out more? Because now, when I see it compared to all these other animal videos, I'm like, oh, that dog video is really cool. And that's like some
Right.
deep inner preference and becomes even more salient given the comparison with other things I may not be that interested in.
Yeah, that is an excellent question, and I think there's no easy answer to that question, which is why I landed up in the territory of behavioral modeling, unfortunately. So I think the way that I think about your comments is that one, there's preferences, which we are kind of trying to measure with how much toxic content people are viewing at baseline, assuming that the algorithm actually learns preferences and it's not garbage, which is probably true because people are leaving when the algorithm is turned off. The second thing about salience is kind of, I would think of it in terms of decreasing returns to exposure or to sharing compared to exposure.
Oh,
So
yeah,
so
that's
that
right.
when I see a lot of it, on the margin, I share one more post, meh. But when I don't see a lot of them, which is what is happening with this particular group of users, I I I get really excited, and the return to sharing that one thing that I just saw is really, really high.
Yeah.
So what I do in the behavioral model is I try to figure out like which one of these effects is more dominant, because in economics the answer to any, any trade-off is both of these things are important.
Yeah.
Maybe we can say a little bit about how much is each of these things, how much do each of these things matter. So in fact, like even there, like I find that the elasticity or the change in sharing based on baseline views is very high. So it does turn out, in my view, it is the case that a lot of it is just being determined by people's priors. And even when there is a change in exposure, that does move things a little bit, like people aren't entirely mechanical, but that change is actually very small, and it's mostly like their baseline preferences that is driving this.
So, humor me on this other possibility, okay? And
Mhm.
this is really coming from maybe someone who's not like you, who really understands the back end of these social media platforms. It's like a less sophisticated user who thinks social media is just like television or news or
Yeah,
newspapers or something like that. Because, there's a very large proportion of the population who do believe that.
right.
Now, there's one other theory I have for why they are sharing more when it's randomized and they see fewer posts that are toxic.
Mhm.
Now, when there's a lot of toxic posts, the assumption might be, oh, everyone's seeing this because I'm getting, 8 out of 10 posts that are toxic. Everyone must be seeing 8 out of 10 posts that are toxic. So now
Right,
I don't need to share it with these other people. But
right.
now when it gets randomized,
Hmm.
I'm seeing very little of it. Right now, it's come down to 10 or 15%, maybe 20%. So maybe others missed it
Right.
because of the assumption. Many people genuinely think Instagram and Facebook and YouTube shorts are like television, right? Like there's
Yeah.
programming going on
Right,
as
right.
opposed to something which is highly personalized. So I thought maybe that might be another reason why people share posts. And this is not exactly salience. It's almost like if you think everyone else is seeing the same stuff you're seeing, then everyone's drinking out of the fire hose. So there's no point sharing it. And you also, it's a little socially awkward to share 20 posts a day with other people. But if
Right,
there's only one or two, you're like, oh, maybe they missed it.
right. From a theoretical perspective, I am in fact assuming that users are sophisticated, in the sense that I am assuming that they think that other people in their social group are also seeing similar things. But the distinguishing feature of this platform is that people share. When I say share, they go off the platform.
Yeah, they share on WhatsApp.
Yeah, yeah. WhatsApp, sometimes even Facebook or Instagram, but mostly on WhatsApp. So I think it's in that sense, like if it were true that people were people were thinking that, oh, everyone's saying the same thing, then there would have been no shares to begin with.
Yeah,
But we do see that there is some sharing that is happening. So that means that people think very differently about, these two things, of like
got it.
one is sharing off the platform and the other is viewing, which we, at least we assume that when they're viewing something, they think that everyone else is also viewing the same thing.
So, how do you really think about the results that you find? Like, I'm very interested in your interpretation of it.
Right. I think first of all, it's very depressing, like to, to have this finding. And I think in my PhD journey, I've only come up with results that are very depressing and kind of unexpected in that sense. Like if we talk about the other paper also, but I also think it's important to realize that demand is very important and that people aren't just passively consuming content and they're active agents. And I mean, these are people who are probably going out and voting for particular candidates. And so I think that a lot of these narratives is, especially like among social scientists, can be a little bit disrespectful towards people's agencies,
Yeah.
that they, oh, it's just the IT cell, we just need to have these supply side interventions and it will all be okay.
I want to spend a minute on this because the way we normally view this marketplace of ideas is there are these passive supply side bots or
Yeah,
IT cells, and people are paid a few thousand rupees to put out all this content and then make it go viral. And
yeah,
on the demand side, also, they're basically sheep. or demand side bots. That's the assumption.
Yeah, yeah,
Right. And the sophisticated people in this model with agency are either the people who are giving content to the IT cells and driving it, or the advertisers, which is,
right,
oh, these are the groups of people who stand to benefit. But we
right,
never truly think about the preferences of the supply side or the demand side. And you're absolutely right that there are people who go looking for certain things. Like I go looking for dog videos. There are people who go
Mhm.
looking for music or humorous content or
Right,
devotional content. And there is a lot of political content. And it
yep,
should not shock us that people
exactly.
are going looking for it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think similarly does work in the US by Matt Janskow and Jesse Shapiro. I really love
Yeah.
this paper about what drives media slant. And,
Yeah.
their conclusions are similar that it's really the demand because even in the US, I mean, assuming that most of us are sort of liberal leaning, a lot of people think uh, that it's Fox News that is driving people crazy. Like it's just Fox News. They watch it, and if we were able to ban Fox News, everything will be okay, and Kamala Harris is going to become president.
And people on the other side think the same thing, right? They think
Yeah,
MSNBC is the devil and it's driving people towards a particular kind of candidate. So
yeah,
I think it's on both sides the assumption is the same. I don't think one side
exactly.
is assuming worse than the other.
Exactly. It's kind of belittling the intelligence of, who you don't agree with, which is bizarre, but also like common, especially among, liberal social scientists. So I think that is something that I really want to put across that, these are people who are demanding this thing. And that actually explains a bunch of other things that we see in the real world also, like, voting patterns and etc. I think the other big thing that the results have helped me think about is regulation, in the sense of it's clear that the regulatory institutions in India are basically non-existent at this point. Like there is the IT Rules Act, which basically tries to infringe upon people's, free speech rights more than anything, because it gives the government a lot more control
Yeah.
on what people can say and do. But on the other side, if someone were to say something in support of the farmers movement, that is the kind of stuff that could still be censored. But on the contrary, if you were to say something nasty about a particular group of people, like it could be Muslims or it could be Christians
Or Sikhs in the case of
or
farmer
Sikhs,
protests.
yes, in the case of farmers' protest, there's basically nothing apart from, like unless someone in the post says go let's go kill these people, then maybe the platform is going to make an effort to ban that particular
Particular
user.
comment. Yeah.
But otherwise there's just no incentive for a particular platform to sort of stop this kind of hatred on the web.
But on the other side, what I find, I mean, while you're right that that part is a little bit depressing, I think the optimistic part is even if they manage to regulate this in a major way, I don't think we can solve it
No,
because this is more about deep seated preference that people hold in general, not necessarily just on a social media platform. That a
right,
particular platform may make it slightly easier to indulge in particular preferences or to make it easier to share particular things.
yeah,
But this seems to be a broader cultural issue than it is about, like, a cultural issue in terms of how we speak with each other and engage with each other. That
right,
seems to be the bigger problem. So I
absolutely,
actually find this quite optimistic that it's not like, because the standard narrative is, oh, all these social media platforms just out there to make money and they're not stopping this. And I'm like, actually, I'm not sure this can be stopped
right.
based on what you find.
Exactly. Yeah, I think in that sense, the thing about thinking about correct interventions in this case, it is really like how do we intervene on attitudes and make people more humane, I guess. But those are, I think, really hard questions, and I think there's been some work on sort of contact hypotheses and so on, and it's not clear to me what that would do either, because in a population as dense as India, again, sort of maybe citing myself and going to the other paper on residential segregation, like what does segregation really mean in India? Is it that people don't have contact with their neighbors, or is it that, I mean, they clearly like live in very close quarters with their neighbors who might be from a different religion or caste, but they fear them in ways that we don't really understand. So I think there's a huge scope for thinking about, sort of even like going beyond theories of contact and so on,
Yeah. A
and think,
broader civic engagement project, right? That I
yeah,
think is the
for sure.
bigger question. Like what used to be civic engagement and civil society and what has broken down,
Yeah.
on the platforms and outside. So, I mean, I know that sounds depressing, but it
Yeah.
almost makes me feel better in some sense.
I think the reason that I say it's depressing is because I have a sense that it was always this way. People just didn't have an outlet to express themselves.
Or maybe they did, it just wasn't public, right? They would say this
Exactly.
among their
Exactly.
very close friends. They would say this in their,
Yeah.
card games or like closed
Exactly.
satsang group, or,
Yeah.
if they have like a girl gang that they
Right.
hang out with, but they're not really expressing this beyond that.
Exactly. And I think that is the biggest criticism of social media, which I think is fair, that social media seems to make it okay to say certain things that weren't okay to say before. So now that this goes back to my assumption on users being sophisticated enough to think that everyone in their social group is getting the same kind of content. And this sort of implies that, other people in my social group are seeing similar kind of content. When I see it on my app, then I think that it's okay to say this particular thing, and that sort of expands the range of socially acceptable ideas in public discourse, which political scientists I think call the written window.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I think social media does contribute to making these things more public, but it's hard to say like how deep seated or like for how long this has been going on. Like how long have people been talking like this about minorities behind closed doors, and now it's just okay to say this on the family WhatsApp group because everyone else is also saying the same thing.
Yeah, that normalization, I definitely agree, is one depressing part of social media. And there, I think the depressing news is what you find about social media platforms lose engagement. That is, people just leave when if
Yeah.
they try to randomize and reduce this kind of personalized echo chamber, which keeps feeding a particular kind of content, they actually lose the users. So
Yeah.
there's always going to be some other social media platform which is willing to indulge that particular preference, and then people will end up there.
Right.
So then it's just a question of how do we just better moderate whatever is the relevant public square, the way we might think of all the really big platforms.
Right. Yeah, it has to be across the board in that case. And the current regulatory framework just does not address it. Like it's not interested in addressing that.
Yeah. No, this is definitely a big one. Now, if you have the time, I'd really like to talk about your other paper because I love the research design of that paper. We talked about this before. So in this paper, you're basically looking at the Rath Yatra in 1990 that was led by L.K. Advani and trying to understand some of the consequences of ethnic violence and segregation in India, but using that as one of the instruments, right? So
Hmm.
if I had to give away like the reductive conclusion, you're basically looking at post-ethnic violence and segregation by studying the route of the Rath Yatra,
Hmm.
and you find that areas closer to the Yatra route are more segregated.
Hmm.
And this has consequences on like outcomes for Muslim households and their education and their income levels and so on. What did you find? How did you go about finding it? Why did you look at this particular question?
So the motivation for this project was to understand the effects of residential segregation on education outcomes to address questions of intergroup inequality. And there I was definitely motivated by the whole research agenda of Raj Chetty, John Friedman, and Opportunity Insights, where, they see that in in the US, like residential segregation is out there for everyone to see. Like I live in Providence, and the east side of Providence, which is
Yeah.
where Brown is completely different from the west
Yes.
side, which is where everyone speaks Spanish. And,
Yeah.
like
It's like two different cities, actually. It's a little
they
alarming.
should be called two different cities because that's what they are. So it's not surprising then that given that the school system is so linked with where you live, the public school system is so linked to where you live, that they find all these negative effects. So I was motivated by this and wanted to see if this is something like this is also true in India. And of course, like every starting PhD student, I went out looking for instruments because residential segregation is obviously going to be correlated with school choice, and where education levels and where people want to live may be correlated with what schools are there in a neighborhood. So I thought that one way to identify this would be to look at communal violence and find exogenous variation in communal violence. So that in itself sort of pushed the paper in a very different direction, where it became less about residential segregation per se and more about the effects of communal violence. And it seems that residential segregation is in the mix, but it is not very clear whether, residential segregation was true always,
Yeah.
or did it happen after the Yatra, because we just don't have that kind of data
Yeah.
in India.
And the underlying mechanism for that kind of segregation is, when there is ethnic conflict or,
Yeah.
ethnic violence, those groups that were either unsegregated and living, in a sort of mixed way, or were sort of semi-segregated, they had their own pockets or hamlets, suddenly segregate a little bit more, right? So it's a way of protecting territory and people of a particular ethnic group, because that's much easier
Right.
than when people are in mixed living. So it's just easier to police a single apartment building that might comprise of a particular kind of ethnic group. And, we've seen this in Bombay when there was religious violence there following the Yatra and the bombings and things like
Yeah.
that. So is that the underlying mechanism? Did I get that right?
Yeah, I think so. I'm not entirely sure if that is the only mechanism,
Yes.
because there's just so many things that are happening there. Now we know from ethnographic work, and Rohini Pandey also had a paper where they look at, where are riots more likely to happen, and they found that riots were more likely to happen in more integrated neighborhoods. And one of their sort of conclusions is that even though they don't have definitive evidence, that then the riot probably led to more segregation of these integrated neighborhoods. Then there's ethnographic work outside of Ahmedabad, where there is a large concentration of displaced Muslim families. And in this ethnographic work, especially by Christoph Jaffrelot, there is a lot of talk about how elders of the community thought about rebuilding. And so instead, like there's this talk about, I think the last time we discussed mobile human capital hypothesis among Jewish communities. So it could be that instead of investing in physical capital for their children, the community elders thought that it was better to invest in human capital for their children, so that is something they can, they have on their body, and is something that would help them assimilate into the mainstream more easily. So one question I get a lot is like, are these madrasas then? And they're not. These are English medium schools. So I think I'm trying to be a little careful here in terms of
Yeah.
exact mechanisms.
No,
uh,
I appreciate that. I appreciate that, because what you're saying is something beyond just safety and territory, right? You're talking about there is a collective action problem across the board on different things, whether it's a particular kind of public good, whether it is safety and policing, but it could also be the kind of school you wish your kids to go to,
Correct.
and
Yeah.
whether your children feel welcome or marginalized in a particular school, right? So
Exactly.
there are all these collective action problems, and
Yeah.
the underlying mechanism might be the broader question of being able to solve these collective action problems better
Right.
if they are closer together, more dense, more segregated, because there are economies that come from that. So that could be
Right.
the simple, non ethnic driven preference. Like
Yeah.
that could just happen to people of different income groups. It could happen to people who speak different languages. In this case, it's different religions. And
Yeah.
then there's, of course, definitely some effect of violence, but it may
Mhm.
not just be the violence.
Right.
Is that a better way of putting it?
Yeah, I think so. And I think just because this bigger project, which eventually became my job market paper, came along, there's one thing that I couldn't do during my PhD, which is do more field work. So I'm hoping if and when someone gives me a job, that I'm able to also, while working, finish working on the job market paper, also sort of go back to this question, because there's very little data on education choices in urban India. Like there's
Yeah.
a big literature on school choice in rural India, but there's hardly anything we know about public and private school mix in India. So it's definitely something that I would encourage other people to look at, and I would also want to jump in at some point.
So, one thing I love about the paper is the research design of using the Rath Yatra. Because when I was reading the paper, I was fascinated by this, right? And now the memories are coming back of, reading newspapers as a child when all this was going on. There's this question of endogeneity, right? Did the Yatra go to places which were already, rife for conflict and, sort of like a tinderbox, right? Like,
Yeah.
that you can trigger quite easily?
Right.
Or did the Rath Yatra actually cause this in some way?
Mhm.
So, to what extent does the research design solve for that? Because you look at both the planned route and the actual sort of yatra that was taken.
Mhm. Mhm.
And what's the difference between the two, and how do we solve for this?
Right. So the research design addresses this reverse causality in riots and the yatra by looking at, as you said, the planned and the actual route, because it's totally fair to conceive that the yatra actually went to places that were more vulnerable, that were more on the edge, or even were more segregated, to begin with. So what happens when L.K. Advani is exiting Bihar is that the chief minister of Bihar at that time, Lalu Prasad Yadav, arrested L.K. Advani and ended the yatra. So that sort of gives us some exogenous, the exact timing of where the yatra was stopped gives us some exogenous variation in exactly where the actual route starts becoming different from the planned route.
Yeah.
So in the paper, what I do is I also show that I do not find the same patterns being replicated with respect to the planned or the placebo route
Yeah.
as the same patterns in the data.
As where he actually went. So these are places that he had intended to go to, which
Yeah.
means they would have, if this was driven by selecting certain places for certain characteristics, then
Right.
they should also have this kind of segregation. They should also have particular kinds of educational segregation, female segregation,
Right.
and the outcomes
Right.
related to that. But now those places were never affected,
Right.
and they don't have it.
And I am able to show a first stage that there was basically no correlation between riots, between the placebo route and the riots that actually happen. And there is a very high degree of correlation between the actual route and places where there were riots
Yeah.
sort of in the lead up to the demolition of the Babri Masjid.
Yeah.
It sounds so weird because now it's Ram Mandir.
Yeah. We're old enough to remember some of this crazy history. But this is a weird thing. There's a weird way in which these things keep coming back. Like now it is the Ram Mandir, but the physical structure might have disappeared, but there's a lot of latent emotional trauma
Right.
associated on both sides with what happened in this, yatra and the riots that followed and the demolition and
Right.
so on. So
Right.
it's really, fascinating, this particular project. Thank you so much for doing this, Aarushi. This was such a pleasure. Looking forward to more of your work, especially the field work you were talking about. And good luck with everything on the job market.
Thank you so much, Shruti.
Ideas of India is produced by the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Help us grow by giving us a rating and leaving a review. Follow us on Twitter at @SRajagopalan and at Ideas of India. Also check out our initiative commemorating 30 years of India's market reforms at the 1991project.com.